everyone. Just waiting a couple of more minutes as participants are coming in. Okay, let's just start. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm Perrine Toledano, the Director of Research and Policy of the Columbia Center of Sustainable Investment, or short CCSI. We are delighted to host this event today. We are very pleased to have a room full of experts on flaring and flare capture projects. A first group of experts will present the findings of our just released reports, and this report is titled Igniting Action to Reduce Gas Flaring, Real Opportunities, Real Projects, Real Results. It is available on CCSI and Capterio websites. The links will appear on the chat very soon. This is a report co-produced by CCSI and Capterio, and it is supported by the Grantham Foundation. The authors, Mark Davis, Andrew Bernstein, and Tom Mitchell, made this report possible by sharing their in-country experience on flare capture projects. Then another group of very sharp experts is joining us today. We have Thomas Bredario from the IEA, Robert van der Gies from the World Bank, Julian Perez from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, Andrew Howell from the Environmental Defense Fund, and TG Comway from RMI. They will comment on the findings and share their perspective on how this seemingly complex flaring question can be fixed with adequate leadership, strategies, and collaboration. We will then open the floor for a Q&A session. Please feel free to share questions throughout the event, and we will take note of these questions in order to share them again after the panel with everyone, with the panelists. Without further ado, please let me now introduce our report. With this report, we aimed at building on existing reports from leading institutions, and we went a bit further. The goal was to identify and celebrate successful flare capture projects, to identify key factors that underpin these successful projects, and all of this with the ultimate goal to inspire actions. More specifically, our contribution to the field is very much anchored in a case study approach to unpick the real backstory. We have covered case studies in great depth thanks to interviews with practitioners with direct experience in flare capture projects, and we've also mobilized rich satellite data to enable quantitative analysis. Distinctly from previous work, our recommendation underscore the need for a holistic approach to net GHG benefits of flare capture projects. We also outline well-targeted responsibilities for each main actor: governments, national oil companies, international oil companies, consuming countries, and financiers. Passing on to Mark.
Thank you, Perrine. The focus of this report is on gas flaring, and that's the burning of so-called associated gas. That's gas that's produced as a byproduct of oil production. It's a large issue. It's a large challenge, but it's a large opportunity annually. It's about 150 billion cubic meters of gas per year that's flared. That's about 4% of global production. It's about, say, $30 billion of revenue opportunity and up to 1 billion plus CO2 equivalent tons. So if we can fix flaring, we can not only reduce emissions, but we can improve energy security, we can generate revenue, and we can accelerate the transition. Now, flaring is also part of a broader family. The family includes so-called venting and leaking, and these are sources of methane within the oil and gas industry. Methane is rightly getting a lot of focus. It's in the news and in the media and in scientific study. That's because it's a highly potent greenhouse gas, 30 to 80 times more than CO2. But the link to flaring is important, and we'll come back to it. And that's because flaring, which is mostly burning the natural gas, also has incomplete combustion. So it does release significant sources of methane. And so by fixing flaring, we can also address this very important methane challenge. The challenge is quite significant. As I mentioned, it's 150 BCM thereabouts. per year. And actually, there's been a lot of commitment and a lot of focus on this by a lot of organizations, led in part by our colleagues on the call from the World Bank. Over 100 organizations have committed to zero routine flaring by 2030. But the reality is that flaring is pretty much flat over the last 2 decades. So too is the flaring intensity. That's a measure of flaring per unit of production. So we need to do something different. And that's why we wanted to write these case studies, to figure out what happens and how we can unlock the so-called barriers. So the so-called barriers, I say so-called because they're often barriers that are cited that hinder progress against flaring today. But we believe that most of these barriers can be overcome. But they include things like a lack of infrastructure. You need to send the gas to the market. A lack of a buyer, a lack of an attractive market. Projects may or may not be complex to deal with. Sometimes there are big data gaps and a lack of awareness. Equally, there's often a lack of penalties or lack of their enforcement. Sometimes the fiscal regimes are not conducive. There may be regulatory obstacles, and sometimes there's a lack of capital or financing. But we believe that most of these barriers can be overcome. In fact, they have already been overcome in the countries and companies that have made progress and in the case studies we illuminate. And the fact that they can make progress does give us a bit of a clue that actually solving flaring is not really a technology issue. It's more an issue that's about commercial agility, organizational change, and the right kind of policy instruments. There are, after all, lots of solutions, as Tom will outline.
Yes, because natural gas is physically different than say, crude oil, there are a range of specific solutions for utilizing or even commercializing natural gas that's flared. And one is to reduce or eliminate the flaring that's due to upset in the operations. And that's usually through improved maintenance or equipment design. Another is to actually re-inject the gas into the reservoirs, which can help improve recoveries of oil and gas, although there's some limitations to that. Another is to use the gas in the operations to power to use as the power for that operation, or even supply gas to a local market. And another is to send via pipeline, either domestically within the country or to export it. And another is to recover liquids, either through liquefying it into LNG, or extracting some of the other liquids like LPGs or condensate. And then finally, there are newer sort of emerging uses that are supplying it directly to industrial places like steel plants, or even into advanced computing power needs. So that's a summary of that. And then now this is a chart that just shows some of the flaring in the world by country, and it shows the height of the chart is the amount of flaring, and the width of the chart shows the intensity, how much is flared per unit of oil produced. And of course, some countries have very high flare volumes, but relatively low intensity relative to production. Some flare very little, but at a very high intensity, and then some have flare high volumes and high intensity. So it does vary around the world. And these differences are usually due to a variety of factors, such as government regulations, commercial structures, funding shortages or availability, and then the political and economic environment. And we get into a little bit of that into our case studies explaining that. And so that was really at the heart of what we tried to look at. Why do some were able to flare reduce their flares, and why some had to or are still flaring at a high level. And we divided the study into basically 3 parts. One is the case studies. That was really the heart of it. That's where we looked at individual situations and what caused some to be more or less successful. And we did 6 of those. And then from that, we extracted the main success factors. There's 5 that we identified. I mentioned some of them, such as the markets and enforcement and leadership and data. And then from that, we looked at what are the actionable recommendations for the 5 sort of main shareholder groups, the companies, the governments, the NOCs, lenders, and the markets. Okay. So just from that, jumping right into the case studies, this one is Angola LNG. I actually have to disclose I worked in Angola. I worked for one of the IOCs, and then for a greater time, I worked for Sonangol, the national oil company of Angola. And so this is the background of this is that there were a series of large deepwater oil discoveries made offshore Angola in the early 2000s. And Sonangol, the national oil company and also partly regulator, set a condition for their development, that they must have a plan to commercialize the associated gas. And the solution that they arrived at was an LNG plant. And it was really the first of its kind that was based, at least initially, solely on associated gas. So what did they do? There's several fields and several different operators, and they all came together to develop this LNG project jointly. There were several companies that formed an integrated transportation, midstream, and marketing companies. This was a key to it, that they weren't sort of competing with each other. They were cooperating to make sure that this worked as best as they could do it. And they overcome some pretty significant physical and technical barriers, such as, in some cases, having to cross the Congo River, or at least with one project, to put a pipeline underneath the Congo Canyon, and even clearing landmines. Those were features of this project that added to the complexity. And the net results were, the economic results were impaired somewhat due to startup problems, due to design, but unrelated to it utilizing associated gas. And the overall result was a reduction in flaring and a net reduction in greenhouse gas. I mean, we tried to measure, and we'll get into that later, other offsets beyond just how much flaring was reduced. And a lot of this was brought together through the leadership and direct involvement of Sonangol, the national oil company. The international oil companies, the IOCs, exhibited a great degree of cooperation and even risk-taking. And the government of Angola itself demonstrated a lot of flexibility in setting fiscal terms, arranging financing, creating laws that enabled this to go ahead. And so we just felt it was a great example of companies, governments, national oil companies working together to try to find solutions to flaring in their country. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. Our second case example is from the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and it relates to the Sarkala field. It's a project that we were slightly involved with at Capterio. The Sarkala field was flaring up to 40 million standard cubic feet per day. That's something like $70 million of gas per year being wasted at old, quote unquote, European prices. But the government realized that it really needed to have reliable power. The local power grid is extensively relying on diesel and heavy fuel oil. It was unreliable, having frequent power cuts and driving civil unrest. So the government realized that, the provincial government, the regional government, realized that by capturing this gas, we could generate power and solve a problem. So it instructed Aggreko, or contracted Aggreko, a British company, to help solve the problem. They installed 200 gas generators, and they remarkably quickly, actually, within 7 months, which is incredible, and they generated up to 165 megawatts of power that went to the regional grid and was bought by the regional government. And the data is really quite compelling. Here, the data from a satellite tracks the flare. We can see a number of features, but the most important of which is that there was a significant reduction of flaring from the 17th of May 2021 and thereafter. And this is independently confirmed by our data. What's driven this? Well, a little bit like what Tom mentioned, this is really driven in part by a really strong top-down push from the regional government. The government wanted the power to improve the livelihoods of the people in the region and the industry. So it's really that top-down leadership. Secondly, to really encourage the upstream partner to act, it made a condition that it required a condition on their intent to increase oil production being that they would address the flares. So by linking the increase in oil production to a requirement to reduce flares, they were able to sort of offer greater motivation to make this happen. It wasn't all plain sailing. It's a challenging location to work. There are frequent payment delays that make it sometimes difficult to operate in conditions like this. But overall, this was a successful project that really captured a waste product, generated real value, and reduced emissions. So our third case study, before I pass over to Andrew to talk about the country case studies, is one from Argentina. And this is a really interesting area because the basin, the Vaca Muerta basin, is seeing huge growth right now as Argentina ramps up its oil and gas production, driven in part by the kind of technologies that have been very successful in opening up the shale basins in the US, the Permian and the Bakken. Now, the operator of this field, Tecpetrol, they wanted a solution for flaring from the very start of their operation. And they thought long and hard about various options, but it turned out that the best option, given that the project was far from a market and there was no pipeline nearby and there's no local power demand, there's no city or major town, the best solution was to capture the gas, generate power, and then mine for cryptocurrency. Now, you and I can maybe have a debate about whether we think cryptocurrency is a good thing or a bad thing. I'll park that for another time. But at least if it's going to be created, it should be done so in an environmentally friendly way. And by using a waste product, flared gas, which otherwise would be emitted with no value, we are creating value from this waste product, or even better, we're displacing another form of gas that would have been used to mine those Bitcoins. So the project was delivered by a specialist contractor, Unblock. They installed, as you can see from the image, actually 8 power generation units, powering 12 containerized high-performance computing units. And they could mine up to 82 Bitcoins per year. The result, as we also showed in the previous chart, was that we can track from space using Flare Intel. We track every flare for every asset every day, and this one is no exception. There was a bit of well testing going on at one facility. The second facility was then tested, and then the mining operation was started up. And from early December 2024, very, very little flaring and significant decarbonization. So, this project was yet again an example where it happened because there was a strong commitment from leadership, supported in this case by the regional and national government to really make this project happen. Andrew.
Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about countries, because I think that'll show what we were talking about earlier, how important policy is in achieving flare reduction. So I'm going to start with Iraq, where I've had the pleasure of working for over 15 years as a legal counsel to the government, including on some of the gas projects that we'll discuss today. So Iraq flares a lot of gas, and it does this even though it has a huge need for gas. It runs its power plants to a large extent on liquids, even though the power plants could run much more efficiently if they were run on gas. It's had a lot of blackouts, which has caused civil unrest. It's had to import gas from Iran, and this summer it's going to start importing LNG, which is a bit ironic given how much gas Iraq has and even how much gas Iraq is flaring. Iraq has had two major flare reduction projects over the past decade or so. First was the Basra Gas Company project, which is a joint venture between a state-owned company and Shell and Mitsubishi, and it's currently processing about 10 billion cubic meters of gas a year, so quite substantial. The second is a project called the Gas Growth Integrated Project, which involves Total Energy, Qatar Energy, and the state-owned Basra Oil Company. That's scheduled to start up this year with early processing, and then eventually it'll process about 3 billion cubic meters a year, up to 6 if there's a phase 2. But what happened is, in between the two of them, a decade passed, and there was a lot of missed opportunity during that time. First, starting in 2014, Iraq experienced severe financial difficulties. Oil prices went way down, and Iraq relies on oil for most of its budget. And also, at the same time, it bore the cost of fighting against the Islamic State. But then, from 2017 to 2021, there was a lot of indecision on the part of the government. Investors were invited to submit proposals for flare reduction, but they weren't given strategic direction or objectives. And the result was a lot of projects being reviewed, but not really comparables, memorandum of understanding signed, but no real projects. That changed starting in 2021 with the Gas Growth Integrated Project. And really, the reason for it was that the government just determined that it was going to go forward with the project. There were no major reforms, no novel structural approaches, just the determination of the government. And that project, as I said, is in the process of moving forward now. So a couple of things that we've seen from these projects. First of all, the Basra Gas Company project has been successful, but really only partially so. In the early years, flaring increased despite the efforts of this company, because oil production was going way up and the additional associated gas was greater than the gas that could be captured and processed. That's been reversed in the last few years, but even now, BGC is only processing about half of what its original goal was, and it didn't construct an LNG facility, which it was supposed to do. This really shows the need to pursue operational performance and also have funding for it in order to make these projects as successful as they can be. The second thing is that these projects are funded by oil revenues in Iraq, which, as we'll see later, kind of raises the question of what exactly are the greenhouse gas benefits from these projects if you're increasing your oil production. You've heard that on some of the other projects as well. But having said that, Iraq really has no other source of revenue to pay for the project, and it's likely that it would have tried to increase its oil production with or without flare capture. So where do things stand now? I'd say in a fairly optimistic place. The government's continue to be determined to launch projects. There are several additional projects that are underway. It has a goal to stop routine flaring in 2028, which may be ambitious, but in any event, it's definitely on a positive trajectory. I'm now going to speak about Algeria. Algeria has modestly high flaring, but it has very high flaring intensity. Now, this may be partially because some of the flaring occurs at gas fields, and so there's no oil production to be in the denominator, because intensity is the volume of flared gas per barrel of oil produced. But whatever the reason, Algeria has significant export infrastructure, pipelines to the EU, LNG, and it appears, at least from public information, to be underutilized. Algeria also has growing domestic gas demand. So like Iraq, Algeria is in a situation where it's flaring gas at the same time as it needs gas and has opportunities to use it. Algeria has had very significant flaring penalties in its law for many years, but the problem is that they don't seem to be collected. And so obviously, if you don't collect the flaring penalties, they're not going to provide a real incentive to capture the flaring gas. And this may be because capturing gas for the domestic market is largely uneconomic, because gas is sold into the market, particularly for power, at very low regulated prices. The market is in the process of being liberalized, but that will take time. Another issue that we've seen in Algeria, and this relates to the data that Mark was talking about before, Algeria reported much lower flaring than independent sources reported. Now that situation is improving, and with improvements in available data, opportunities have been identified. Capterio identified several opportunities in 2019. The government has published write-ups on some of those opportunities in the last few years, and those write-ups show that the projects have very attractive potential economics. They just need to get done. So, in summary, Algeria has made progress, but it has a lot more opportunities that it could seize. To do that, it's going to have to use its infrastructure effectively. It'll have to back that by enforced penalties. And if it does that, it really has a number of economically attractive seeming projects. The last country I'm going to talk about is Egypt. Egypt has relatively modest flaring volumes, but still quite high intensity. The 9.1 cubic meters per barrel figure you see there is about twice the global average. It has growing domestic gas demand, but it's had declining production from its non-associated gas fields in recent years. Non-associated gas means fields where gas is the primary product. So it doesn't take oil. It's not gas that comes out with oil production. It's gas that comes from a gas field. There have been power blackouts in the last few years reported in Egypt during the summer months. And this year, Egypt has committed to avoid those, but it's going to do that by importing very expensive LNG. It's announced a few major contracts to do that. Like Algeria, Egypt has organized new licensing rounds to try to generate new non-associated gas, but those take time, and you never know whether they're going to be successful or not. But meanwhile, it seems to us that capturing flared gas would be a much quicker solution and probably more cost-effective. To capture the gas that's flared in Egypt, two main things have to happen. First, the concession agreements in Egypt provide the state holding company called EGAS with what's effectively a monopoly on gas purchases. And so as long as that continues, EGAS, like in Algeria, had to sell in the domestic market at low regulated prices, a bit higher than Algeria, but still quite low. And so unless the market is completely reformed, EGAS is going to have to commit to purchasing the captured gas from the current from the flare reduction projects, and that effectively will require a subsidy if EGAS is going to sell the gas at lower prices. But the fact is that subsidies are also needed to purchase expensive LNG imports, or they will be needed to purchase the new non-associated gas that will be provided. So probably the subsidy needed to purchase captured flare gas is lower than what's needed for these other purposes. The second issue that we see in Egypt is that it has a lot of small scattered flares, mostly in the Western Desert region, although it appears that about 70% of them are within 20 kilometers of a main pipeline. But to capture that gas, Egypt is going to have to organize cluster infrastructure, in other words, infrastructure that gets gas from many flares in many fields, and that will generate economies of scale. All of that is possible. It takes mainly effective planning and determination. And I know you've heard the word now several times, but that's really what it takes. Egypt has real opportunities, and it can make flare capture part of its near-term solution for what are persistent gas shortfalls. Mark?
Thank you, Andrew. In the interest of time, we'll skip the main success factors because they're embedded in much of our thinking that we will come back to. But we'll just talk about some of the actionable recommendations. There are two actionable recommendations. The first, as we've alluded to, is the need for a holistic approach on greenhouse gas accounting. And the second is some specific actionable recommendations for 5 individual stakeholder groups. Now, we alluded to this a few times during the call earlier. We very much want to understand what the true impact of reduction projects are from flare reduction projects. And when we thought about this long and hard, we realized there are 2 main drivers. The first driver is one about methane. By capturing gas at a flare, we can reduce the volume of gas that goes to the flare, but we also reduce the amount of methane that goes. That's methane that is released through incomplete combustion, and it's highly potent. So that's a really important lever. And our chart on the right shows the before and after case. Reducing methane through solving the flare is a major reduction initiative. The second is that gas, when captured, can be put to good use. And it can be used, for example, to generate power that would then displace another form of more carbon-intensive generation. So we saw this in Iraq, for example, where diesel or heavy fuel oil is being burnt to generate power. Equally, it's been done in, for example, in Egypt, where diesel is being used to power local oil field operations, which are then replaced by gas that's captured. But equally, this captured gas could be used to displace other forms of gas. And it could even stop the need for gas exploration. And this is actually one of the benefits of the Angola LNG project, is that gas was brought to market and arguably it displaced coal and other forms. So, if you do those two effects, you can deliver dramatic reduction by up to 80% reduction in emissions. But that's unfortunately not the whole story, also as we've alluded to, because sometimes the justification for doing a flare capture project is to produce more oil. And we kind of saw that in Iraq. We heard from Andrew. Equally well, you could argue that's what was going on in, for example, Argentina. And if the oil production is increased as a result of the commitment to reduce the gas flaring, we need to consider the emissions in the round. And the chart on the right then puts the emissions reduction we saw from the per se flare in a broader context. And of course, unsurprisingly, the emissions from the system are mostly driven by oil. Now, and that means that the 80% reduction we saw from the flare capture project, looking at just the emissions from the methane, the flare, and the alternative power source, are reduced from 80% to 17% of the total. And any emission saving you get is undermined if the oil production increases by, it turns out, more than about that 20% figure. So this really just highlights that when we think about flare reduction projects, we need to do the accounting in the right way. We need to think about the impact on methane as a positive. We need to think about the ability to displace alternative fuels, but we need to think about what the implication are for increased oil production, if that is indeed the justification. Now, what does this all lead to? This leads to a framework. We don't have too much time to go into it, so I'll keep it very brief. Just in summary, methane reduction, fuel substitution, plus or minus oil production impact. And what this means is that we really need to deploy our limited funds of capital that we have to solving gas flaring on the most impactful projects. And I'm going to talk just briefly about the three we think are most impactful. Number one, projects where the oil production project will go ahead, regardless of whether there's a solution or not, have to be the top priority. Iraq is a case in point. The Iraqi government is no doubt going to be prioritizing that oil production. If flaring is not addressed, that's going to be a big problem. This will have the most impact. Secondly, there are plenty of projects around the world, and we hear this repeatedly when we speak to operators, where actually just running the project better, having better performance, better equipment reliability, better maintenance, backed up by data, using data as a performance tool, really drives reduction of emissions, particularly around upset flaring emissions. And thirdly, my last example, and I think Algeria, as outlined by Andrew, was a really great example, where we can capture gas that does not require any new major infrastructure. This has to be prioritized. And Algeria is a case in point. There are large flares close to existing pipelines. Many of those pipelines have have spare capacity, and they take the gas to a hub. There are 3 pipelines that go to Europe, 2 LNG plants that go to Europe and beyond, and they're all running at underutilization. So these could be utilized and capture that gas, and therefore reduce emissions, create value, and accelerate the energy transition. Andrew, over to you for a brief version of our actionable next steps.
Indeed, it'll be very brief, and we have lots of recommendations, and I really encourage you to read them in the report. They're divided for each stakeholder group, but very quickly, we're going to touch on just a few of them right now. The first and most important thing for a project is that there has to be what we call an investable environment. That means an accessible market. That means a credit-worthy off-taker. This could come from a free market like in the EU. It could come from an export market. It could be a commitment from a state-owned company to purchase or pay for gas. we see lots of major reform proposals, but the fact is that whatever solution there is, it has to be consistent with the tradition of a country, even if it's not perfectly efficient. The main thing is that it has to work. There has to be some viable outlet for the captured gas, and that is really the fundamental building block. And governments are really in a position to provide that. And once that's in place, what governments can do is apply positive and negative incentives, fiscal terms, contractual flexibility, penalties, and the like, to incentivize operators to take advantage of these markets. National oil companies have a great role to play as well. One key step is for them to integrate data and information into their management processes so that they know about the opportunities. What are these opportunities? They can then push with their governments, with their international partners, to make the projects that they want to do a reality. Oil producers, and mainly international, but not only, clearly have a key role to play in structuring projects. It's not only in their upstream operations, but identification of markets and looking at opportunities more generally. And if parts of flare capture projects, the industrial portions, are outside of their core business areas or don't meet their upstream return objectives, well, it's really incumbent on them to identify and work with additional investor classes to make these projects work, because they really are uniquely positioned to do this because they have the context to do that. Finally, consuming countries, financial institutions, they need to provide the funding, even if they're otherwise reluctant to fund fossil fuel projects. This doesn't necessarily mean lending to well-resourced international operators, but flare projects, for example, can result in short-term negative cash flow to governments and national oil companies, even if they're attractive overall. And observing and focusing on that negative cash flow and funding that gap can be important to making those projects happen. Again, we have many, many more recommendations. Please read them, but I will stop there for now.
Thank you very much. So here's a reminder of our main highlights. These slides now, the full report, the full case studies are now available on the CCSI and Capterio websites. We really warmly encourage everyone to read them. Now we're turning to our fantastic panel of expert discussants. We will have 2 rounds of questions. Unfortunately, as the moderator, I won't have time to react to the discussant reflections and comments. I'll simply be passing the floor from one panelist to the next to keep us on schedule. Thomas, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure.
Yes, you are the lead methane analyst at the IEA, and I'd like to ask you the following question. Our report argues that the primary motivation for government to support enabling infrastructure for flare capture project is its cost-effective contribution to energy security. In your view, is that correct? And how can government best create an enabling environment to unlock action?
Absolutely, yes, that's very correct. I mean, when we look at the amount of gas that is wasted either through flaring or methane emissions, it can make a huge difference to energy security. I mean, the report goes into great details onto this. I'm not going to go further, but yeah, great work just highlighting this. Now let's perhaps spend a bit more time thinking about what can the government do. And I think there is a very clear message here from the study is that governments have a key role to play. Not that the oil and gas companies themselves can't do anything. They also have their responsibility. Financiers and other stakeholders can also contribute, but governments have really a key role. And in each setting, they will need to achieve a different mix of, say, carrots and sticks to drive action. And there are different ways to think about this. We often outline 4 regulatory approaches to this. So first is kind of command and control, or as we heard here, a bit of top down. You say there can be no routine flaring. This project will only go ahead if you meet the conditions to make this gas reach a market. That can be quite challenging for certain operations, but it's a very straightforward way to do things and comes with many benefits. A second way to do it is to work on market-based instruments. So we heard about, for example, putting a fee or eliminating natural gas subsidies or making it so that the gas is priced according to export markets and not internal prices. So this is another opportunity. This often will make it a bit more flexible for operators to address the most cost-effective opportunities. So it's another good option and one to have in mind. I think we heard some good cases here during the session. Another option is to think about performance standards. So this is more, say, you are required to use 99% of the gas that you're producing or a certain amount. And this means that there's still some amount of flexibility and that operators, they can deal with the upsets and the maintenance and the issues that they will normally have, but that they reach a high level of performance and that most of the gas is put to good use. And there are different ways to do this. This can be applied to combustion efficiency, for example, one thing that Mark was highlighting here. It's a major issue, right? Methane slips from flares, they are very important contribution to climate change. And one of the things you can do is just make sure that these flares are being monitored. You're monitoring the combustion efficiency. You're taking measures so that you minimize that amount of slip that is occurring in flares. And then last, but certainly not least, you can take an information-based approach. So this is about monitoring the volumes that are being flared, bringing greater transparency to this data so that you can, for example, rank operators or publish the data so that it's easier to identify projects, so that other actors like financiers or banks, they can act on this too. And in general, you have a bit more data to work on and better manage these projects.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I like that clear typology of policy instrument. Robert, you are next. You are the senior gas specialist at the World Bank. I'd love to ask you the following. Flaring has been the World Bank focus for a long time, and in many ways, the World Bank has played an important convening role in this conversation. Now, in a global conversation that is now very focused on methane, how can we maintain sufficient focus on flaring reduction as an emission reduction lever?
Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet you all. In fact, we're very happy to see that this event is happening today. Well, everybody seems to be talking about methane nowadays. And you're right, we've been concerned about gas flaring for more than 20 years. And while the problem is still as relevant and as urgent as ever, I'm sorry to see that there appears to be a little bit of a growing feeling of old news and resignation that we may not be able to do much about it. That, of course, is not very helpful. In fact, it's not very helpful that methane has been stealing the show lately, as you suggest. Even though we would probably agree that methane action is also important, and in fact, very important. So let's not lay that down too much. So methane definitely deserves the attention I think it's getting. Now, I would like to argue that that's not necessarily bad. And in fact, that's the focus on abating methane emissions may actually be helpful in reopening the door for a dialogue with oil and gas operators also on flaring. And we see that in our work in the World Bank on a daily basis. When we do engage, I must admit, on methane, particularly today, with many oil and gas operators, which now also includes, in particular, national oil and gas companies. And just to give you a few examples, if you consider the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, or OGMP partnership, which is, of course, the de facto industry standard for monitoring and reporting of methane emissions, operators are typically compelled to pay closer attention to flaring as well when they apply this standards, because flaring is an important source of methane emissions. So the focus on methane and the standards then allows you to pay more attention to flaring. I think also in terms of our own project work, one of, for example, our eligibility criteria for receiving grant funding from the World Bank through our Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership is that you adopt and implement a zero routine flaring policy. So it's indirect, but I believe that the focus on methane And the action on methane can actually drive action on flaring also. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That's reassuring. Julian, turning it to you. You are the Managing Director of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, or GCI. My question for you is as follows. In our report, we highlight the role of companies in prioritizing flaring reductions and collaborating proactively with national oil companies and other relevant stakeholders. Do you agree with these recommendations overall? How do you see the industry and its stakeholders working together to accelerate progress in reducing flaring? And could companies do more to enhance this collaboration?
Thanks a lot, Perrine, and thanks for having me joining this session. First of all, kudos to on the report, excellent work and very clear and very rich in content. Well, the first thing is that I think at the GCI we are very well aligned with the recommendation that have been highlighted in the report on the role of companies to prioritize flaring actions, data transparency, and work collaboratively. I think that's a very important aspect that we've experienced. And I can share a little bit what we've been observing because we've been doing that now for 10 years on different aspects, but flaring has been embedded somehow in the DNA of OGCI because part of the commitment that we ask the companies to sign up to when they join the organization is to commit to zero routine flaring by 2030, along the line of the efforts that have been carried out over by the World Bank for many years. So yes, working collaboratively on flaring makes sense and actually does deliver results. What we have observed is that first of all, we needed to start on understanding, among the members and progressively, work over what are the solution that can help to deliver flaring. A bit of what the case studies that have been eloquently displayed by the previous speakers. And then working as well on data. So we had a collaboration with the Payne Institute, for instance, for more than 4 years to increase accuracy and transparency and accessibility of flaring data. And so all of this information is shared, through a platform and also through a collaboration with the World Bank GFMR to make it more publicly available. So flaring continued to be a key topic, and we do see collaboration working, and the numbers speak by itself because since the start of OGCI, so we have been launched at the UN Climate Summit in 2014, we started to collect robust data across the 12 companies from 2017, let's say. But between 2017 and 2023, what we've observed is that both in intensity, in absolute volumes, on a routine basis, and also on a greenhouse gas basis, I would say like ballpark figure, we have cut the quantity by half. So on all of those KPIs across the last 5 years to make it simple. So I think putting commitments first and targets, a clear goal at the top level of the organization is key. Sharing how you do it, both from a technical and a business perspective, makes sense as well, and it works. And so that's the model that we have carried over. Now at COP28, there's been a new initiative that was launched, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, OGDC. Sorry, it's another acronym. In the climate world, it's full of acronyms, but we're adding one to the list. And this one is bringing along 56 companies signing up to a series of commitments, both on flaring, methane, scope 1 and 2, but also on expanding their portfolio of low carbon solution. And likewise, they have all of those 56 companies have signed up to zero routine flaring by 2030. So we are basically like replicating the model that we have followed through GCI again to share this knowledge and engage the national companies to help them to reduce their flaring. So we are at the beginning of the journey with some of them, providing technical support and trainings, but there's a lot of appetite. What we're observing is that they really want to achieve the goal they have signed up to. We already trained close to 800 professionals across 30 companies. So we hope to see results. Last year, we made a baseline report. This year, we're going to deliver a progress report and hopefully starting to see a reduction in the flaring. Now put things in perspective, just to manage expectation. The 56 companies that have signed up to a GDC are only representing 40 to 45% of the oil and gas production worldwide. So that means that you still have 50% that are outside of this group. I'm not saying that they are not doing anything, but I'm not saying neither that we're going to resolve the entire issue only by our own. So very much welcoming as well collaboration furthermore.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Julian, to give us an idea of where we are today and to adjust expectations. Andrew, you are the head of research in sustainable finance at EDF. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the following. We argue that NOCs should be mandated to reduce flaring and leverage joint ventures to enforce flare capture projects. Flare capture. What has EDF's work revealed about how NOCs are or are not using their leverage in joint ventures to advance flare capture?
Well, thank you, Perrine. Thanks for having me on the call to launch this report. I'll echo the other panelists. It's just a fabulous report, and particularly these case studies really advances, I think, the debate we've had around flaring to really be very concrete. And it's just amazing storytelling in this Capterio data. So congratulations to all. The phrase used to refer to flaring that I've heard is it's the black eye of the oil industry. And I think it really is clear from this data that there is just way more flaring taking place. This is driving economic and environmental loss. And it's just incredible that flaring is not going down. Despite what Julian said about OGCI members, there's clearly progress happening in places, but the overall data, you can't really hide for the fact that flaring has been disturbingly flat for over a decade. That's an important difference between flaring and methane is an issue. Is that flaring you really can observe much more easily. Methane is still a big challenge, as we know. And so what we see is this is a huge issue. And it often is an issue with the national oil companies, something that we at EDF are working on very hard, NOC methane and flaring. And, key pieces of infrastructure clearly are missing in many NOC contexts. You have aging infrastructure that leads to flaring because capacity bottlenecks, lack of incentives at the NOC level to bring down flaring as much as you would want to. And I think that is a big challenge in terms of these incentives where even if a flaring project may be affordable, you have lots of claims on the cash that could potentially go to that flaring abatement project. And this makes it harder to see the progress that you could. It's great to see in these case studies there are some pockets that are encouraging. In our own work, we would highlight maybe a couple of others. The case of Kazakhstan, I'll just mention, because we've been looking at it recently. And, on the chart at the beginning, which showed the different countries, Kazakhstan's intensity is well below the average. They used to be well above the average. They've seen flaring decrease 70% over the past decade. And I think here, regulations really have been key. You had good anti-flaring regulations in Kazakhstan. And what's been, I think, helpful is the fact that you have a lot of IOCs. You have 5 super majors that are operating in Kazakhstan. And so the government is not just finding its own national oil companies, also has foreign companies that it can find and for flaring violations. And so it's the IOCs that have really driven the flare reductions. That also has allowed the knowledge from that to feed back to the NOC, which is KMG. And there's still some challenges like lack of a really viable domestic gas market in Kazakhstan. But nevertheless, that's encouraging. And I think that's worth looking at that example. In Latin America, we've seen a lot of progress as well. Ecopetrol and Petrobras have driven flaring lower. I think this is also partly because of good policies, particularly in Brazil, that has been helpful here. There's another angle I think is important, which is that working with the joint venture partners that Perrine mentioned. And here I'll go back to the Algeria example. So Andrew Bernstein gave a great summary of the challenges with Algeria, very high flaring intensity. But we are seeing some good evidence from the NOCs from Sonatrach that they're making some headway against this. And what they're pointing to is collaboration with ENI, the joint venture partner, who is giving them some of the help on technical side and even on the financing side to kind of try to make some traction against this huge problem. Other countries moving in the wrong direction. So clearly this is an issue that needs a lot more focus. This report cannot come at a better time. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and for also showcasing additional successful case studies. That's important to know them. TJ, turning to you, you're a principal at RMI. I'm curious to hear your thought on this. We emphasize in the report that we emphasize prioritizing flare capture projects that are net positive for climate based on a full life cycle GHG impact. But since solving flaring can also reduce methane and thereby further improving the efficiency of existing assets, what are the best ways to get people focused on taking an integrated life cycle approach and not just focus on scope 1?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. Yeah, again, echoing what everyone has said, this is a great piece of analysis, and I think providing that sort of concrete view at the case level has been really helpful, and I think enlightening even for those who have spent a lot of time thinking about flaring and methane over the years. And yeah, I think just to also reinforce some of the points that Andrew just made, it is quite striking that we still see flaring at these levels, despite the fact that it's so much clearer than in the case of methane, where we're still really learning, but also transparency around that has improved dramatically. When it comes to sort of scope, this questions around scope 1 versus scope 3 and full life cycle assessments. First of all, I think that's even just the couple of charts that you have shown to kind of see the sort of the impacts of reducing flares, even in the context of perhaps incentivizing additional production in oil, I think are really helpful. And I'll get to that a little bit in a second. But one, we all know that tackling flaring and methane are mission critical for the climate, regardless of whether they're scope 1 emissions for an upstream producer or those same emissions are considered scope 3 emissions for a buyer. And it's important to have incentives that align in support of this rapid near-term abatement. I'll just give you an example that's a bit outside of this case, but I think is helpful. We've done life cycle work analysis to show that reducing leaks from upstream can actually result in a more than 25% reduction in the product carbon footprint of steam cracker products and petrochemicals, right? And yet petrochemical producers often favor addressing only their scope 1 and 2 emissions, just due to carbon accounting frameworks and incentives. And so this is just an example of how there is, in some cases, sort of not necessarily the alignment that is needed across the entire value chain to prioritize some of the most impactful measures that can be taken. That's why the work that we do at RMI is so focused on leveraging our in-depth expertise on life cycle modeling of oil and gas through end use. Many of you have probably heard of the Oil Climate Index plus gas tool, which was created about a decade ago to prioritize analysis and raising awareness about the degree to which emissions intensities can differ across different sources of oil and gas, and how a full value chain picture is really needed to make the most impactful decisions for the climate. And from the upstream perspective, looking down the value chain to scope 3 end use, this report and complementary analysis underscore just how much lost gas can be recovered to meet near-term demand needs. And I think that's we're 150 BCM. If you think about that in terms of just, let's say, global LNG trade, obviously not all of that would be going into trade, but we're talking 25% of trade. That's significant. And we also know that with good analysis by the IEA and others like S&P, just how much of that that lost gas can be recovered at positive net present value. So it's really important to bear all of that in mind. Now, the point on sort of the risk that flare capture contributes to new oil production is really important. And I think that, like I said, this paper's done a really good job of kind of articulating the risk and developing a framework for prioritizing flaring mitigation to minimize this risk. I don't want to kind of preempt some additional points that I think might be made about the methane finance working group that we've been collaborating on, but I just want to emphasize that that work too also highlights the potential lock-in risk of financing methane abatement, but also outlines ways to try to avoid and mitigate lock-in risk, and so that's very much at the forefront of our minds. And just the last point that I'll kind of leave with everyone is that we really need to strengthen the alignment of actors' incentives across the full value chain, so that we can address these issues. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, TJ. All very important points. I'm inviting all panelists here to put on the chat the links to your respective work to ensure that everyone has access to all the resources. Robert, I'm turning back to you. Fixing flaring, we'll need serious investment, perhaps in the order of $100 billion. The World Bank launched in COP28 a new fund to accelerate flaring reduction. How is this now catalyzing action? And how can we best unlock other sources of funding to make the investment happen despite the world commitment to not expand fossil fuels?
Yeah, thank you. In fact, before I answer your question, I'd like to make a point about our policy in the World Bank to consider financing for emission reduction projects. So even if they are in the oil and gas sector, and even if they would be for companies who would perhaps not be eligible clients otherwise. So at least in our institution, we don't mind lending money if it's for a good cause, even in the oil and gas industry. But of course, I recognize the sensitivity of providing financing to the oil and gas sector globally. Now, we actually often get this question about how can we get enough money together to reduce flaring and methane emissions? And to be quite honest, I feel it's maybe a little bit like beginning on the wrong end, if you don't mind. I think that as bankers would typically tell you, and not just in this sector, but in any sector, that it's not about the lack of money. And I know it's a little bit of a dumb thing to say, but it's about the lack of good projects. And I think it's also the key to the answer here. If you look at the good case studies that were presented earlier, I didn't hear a word about the financing. I only heard words about how great projects they were, how they would take gas and turn it into something that could be commoditized and sold. So rather than asking ourselves how we can eliminate all flaring, how much money we need in total, I would like to strongly encourage everybody to think bottom up, project by project. How can we identify good opportunities? And in particular also support oil and gas operators to identify those opportunities. And this is in fact a large part of what we do in the World Bank today in flaring and methane reduction is we provide technical and financial advisory to in particular national owned companies who may not be so familiar with this way of thinking. So to help them to develop the projects, even before we talk about the money parts. Now, this also includes for many of our clients to find their way in the financial system, which, as you may know, often involves addressing risk and describing how you can de-risk the project. Some of our clients are simply not familiar with that way of thinking. Now, because let's not forget, similar to the examples that were presented, that many of these projects are in fact cash positive. So they should be possible, right? If you present them in the right way. Now, of course, there's another big hurdle that clients face, which is the financial viability of the companies themselves. They may not have, or they may have a very bad credit rating. And that, of course, doesn't help when you want to borrow money, even if the project is a good one. So a second important element of what we do in the World Bank is to provide guarantees. We basically take away the risk of payments, for example, on a particular project, which means that the project can go ahead with some security for the financiers, which doesn't necessarily need to be the World Bank, but it could also be commercial lenders then in this case. So at the end of the day, we have a small trust fund. We have about $250 million, which of course is nowhere near the 100 billion. That was just for flaring. So all we can hope to be is to be catalytic here and to take away some of these rough edges around the financing that can open the door then to the mainstream market to come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Super clear. Julian, with OGCI's new satellite monitoring campaign, which seems to be more focused on methane and on flaring, how do you see real-time data, such as that we are extensively using in our report? How is this real-time data changing the landscape for methane and flaring accountability at companies level? What kind of behavioral change is it actually driving?
Thanks, Perrine. Yes, you're right. The satellite monitoring campaign was like focusing on the other big topic that we're trying to deal with, which is methane emissions. But it has been said by previous speaker, it could be seen as well as a proxy to address the flaring. Actually, it happens that in many cases we did observe in a number of cases that the methane source was related to a flare or venting. So for instance, if I give you some example, we started with Iraq and extended them to Algeria, Egypt, and Kazakhstan. But if I just give you the example of Iraq, for instance, we have seen that flaring was one of the primary sources of methane emissions that was detected. Was either associated gas flare and the uncombustion due to the flare inefficiency. And that was particularly true, of course, for older installations, as well as direct venting, such as temporarily unit flare. And also sometimes it was maintenance events. And if I take, for instance, the specific case of one of the assets that we monitored during the campaign in Iraq, where the likely emission source was attributed to incomplete combustion from a flare, we assessed actually that the technical solution to upgrade the flare and eliminate ignition problems can be installed in Iraq on that asset at a cost that was between $1 and $20 per tons of CO2 equivalent. There was no additional revenue generated from the gas saving, as the gas was remaining flare, but it was improving the flare. And so that example was, quite a very low cost solution for the project. So the data, and we've observed the same thing, on Algeria, Egypt, and Kazakhstan. Like the ballpark figure was between 5 to 10% of the methane observation were associated with the flare in those cases. It's not a generality. I'm just sharing like the experience that we had. We are now expanding it to 5 other countries, so hopefully we'll be able to fill up as well with more statistics. But so what we are observing is that the data and giving the data to the NOCs is sometimes a very good way to start the engagement. And that has been quite a lesson learned for us, is that, basically we are putting a satellite up in the sky and saying to the operator, we're going to monitor you. And we don't want them to feel that it's Big Brother watching them, but rather saying, we're going to monitor you, we're going to share the data with you, and we're going to help you to fix the leak, because we feel that it's a more efficient way to get to climate impact. And so, yes, data has been a key enabler because it gives us a foot in the door for a broader engagement with operator than just pushing data and that's it. So we do have quite a lot of engagement going on. And we really see a lot of added value in this engagement to raise awareness on both the problem and the data and help them to resolve it.
Thanks a lot, Julian. So really data as a game changer here. Andrew, you've explored financial instruments to enable cash-constrained national oil companies to finance methane abatement. What concrete mechanisms are you working on to accelerate and unlock financing to enable national oil companies to scale flare reduction efforts?
Thanks, Perrine. And first, just maybe if I can comment on Julian's point on the better data from satellites on methane. I think there's a great opportunity here to actually combine the methane data we're getting from the whole range of satellites that are growing every year for methane with the existing quite good data we have on flaring. And there's actually been some initial work trying to take EDF's methane sat data and combine that with the VIIRS data on flaring and seeing what lessons can be learned from that. So I think there's just a huge set of opportunities around working with this Earth observation data set. Very exciting opportunity. But in terms of financing, I agree with Robert that you need good projects. On the other hand, $8 to $10 billion a year needed for methane is still quite a big check. And sometimes the capital may be there, but it's like in the wrong place. And it also has expectations around deploying that capital that are not really being met. So I mean, that's kind of get to your point about projects. So all of that is true. There is some very exciting work being done to create frameworks to help finance methane abatement. TJ already referred to this. The Methane Finance Working Group is an initiative that came out of COP29, and it's kind of working behind the scenes quite hard with a lot of different stakeholders who are contributing to what would an effective financial instrument that is targeting methane abatement look like. And actually, when you think about those instruments, a lot of them actually are going to be about flaring, ultimately, because flaring is one of the what we consider low-hanging fruit of oil and gas methane. Flaring is kind of towards the bottom of the low-hanging fruit. So what the folks involved in this working group have been thinking about is, what would a financial instrument look like? How do you address some of the challenges, for example, that a lot of flaring abatement and other methane projects are actually quite small. And investors like bonds to be big. Like it's hard to issue a bond of less than, say, $250 million. Many projects will be smaller than that. So, we need to kind of find ways to pool capital and deal with these types of challenges. But it does look like there are a few options that could be interesting as we take this forward. One would be a use of proceeds instrument, along the lines of, what we think of as a green bond or green loan, but it's targeting uses of proceeds that would be methane specific, either methane measurement or abatement solutions. So new compressors, new takeaway pipeline, all the types of things could enable that. So that would be the use of proceeds approach. There's another approach which would be more the sustainability linked, so a KPI type of instrument. So the coupon could be dependent on the achievement of certain targets, such as reduction of flaring intensity or flaring volumes. And flaring is a great candidate for this because it is possible to measure that, not perfectly, but quite well. And then there's a third option, which would be more of a plain vanilla instrument. So it wouldn't be labeled, but it would have a covenant quite well designed around what we're trying to solve for here, which is methane. So a lot of work done. Technical guidance will be published fairly soon on these approaches, and hopefully what we really care about is some real world deals that would come out and channel capital towards this. And so let's bring on a methane bond or maybe a flaring bond.
Awesome. Innovative financing ideas coming up from EDF. That's great. TJ, last but not least, going back to the data question. So as part of the Carbon Mapper Consortium that launched its first satellite last year to detect point source emissions, RMI has contributed to a new level of emissions transparency. So how do you see satellites-based data shifting the global fight against flaring and methane leaks? Can it attract global attention to oil and gas companies' responsibilities?
Yeah, for years, just one of the biggest barriers to action had been lack of reliable, publicly available data on methane. And so, first and foremost, I think it's important to acknowledge and celebrate just how much progress has been made in this area. over just a few short years, really. And the launch of Methane Sat and Carbon Mapper's Tanager 1 satellites last year really have been remarkable achievements, especially in the context of publicly available data solutions. This is starting to translate, I think, and this is a big focus for RMI among many of us, is on translating that data into action. And there are various ways or use cases to be thinking about. First and foremost, there's a really important role for RMI and others to just raise awareness about the availability of this data and the value that the data provide for supporting methane mitigation. In many instances, simply informing operators that they have a leak is what is needed for the leak to get fixed. Not in all instances, but actually in a remarkable number. And related to awareness, sort of this awareness raising is helping to advance and capacity building to make the best use of data. And so what we're in RMI in partnership with the Africa Center for Energy Policy and some other organizations are launching the Global South Methane Training Network this month. And data to action is going to be a really important priority here, making sure that various stakeholders in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, have access to the tools, resources that they need to inform their decision making about their methane and flaring abatement strategies. I think we've already discussed a bit of some of the other use cases, in the case of finance and others. But just to emphasize that this new satellite data is going to continue to play an essential role in shaping those use cases. There's also a lot of complementarity across whether it's different types of satellites like Carbon Mapper, which is more point source oriented, and Methane Sat, which is aerially oriented. They're complementary technologies in the satellite space, and satellites are complementary technologies with other forms of detection and measurement technology. And so it's not like there's any one single solution, but the combination of those solutions can really be leveraged in policy, in even tracking KPIs, for example, in the type of instruments that Andrew was just mentioning. And so they will help with, as I said earlier, strengthening the alignment of incentives between different actors to achieve our flaring and methane mitigation goals.
Thank you so much. A good point on the fact that these efforts are not duplicative but complementary. And after all, we have a lot of tools today with today's technologies to make it happen. Thank you so much to our panelists. A lot of Q&A conversation is happening on the chat and with answers being written. I hope these answers are satisfactory. It seems that they've all been answered. If this is not satisfactory enough, please say it on the chat. Mark, I'll pass on to you in order to insist on a couple of points that are important to take away.
Thank you, Perrine. It's and I'd just like to acknowledge all the people who've been involved in the case studies. We have had so many rich conversations, as Tom perhaps alluded to, with people who know the projects in detail, whether they are current or former employees or members of governments. It's been a really detailed study. And just to put the flaring opportunity in another couple of sort of units, so to speak, it's staggering. Andrew, you said it's staggering how large it is. It's equivalent to powering 300 million average UK homes with electricity. It's equivalent to taking 220 million US passenger vehicles off the road. And it's equivalent to $1,000 per second in potential revenue. This is big. And I'd just like to echo a couple of things that have been said by, I think, TJ and by Julia and also by Robert. Data, we cannot underestimate the power of data here. Data is a game changer. And, we've experienced this, in real time by working with loads of players on the real-time satellite data that we offer at Capterio with Flare Intel. And what's really interesting is that data is required to drive action. Unless you have data, unless you have good data in-house, which some companies do, but many don't, you will be missing opportunities. So data really helps to identify those opportunities. And then, Robert, to build on something you said, we need to drive the opportunities to actual investable projects. And it's not so much a lack of financing to fund the investable project. The missing gap is the projects don't come to financing because they're not technically and commercially mature enough. And that's really, if I had a plea for the industry for us to think collaboratively and holistically, it's let's use the best data available to find the best opportunities, screen them, develop them, and then we can go and get the financing for them, because there's such a huge prize to be got here. A prize, just to restate it, reducing emissions, Thomas, improving energy security. We don't need to drill new wells. We can actually capture the gas we already produce and waste, and to create revenue and to accelerate the transition. So, back to you, Perrine. Thank you. It's been a delight to have you all on the panel and to work with so many people on this project. Perrine.
Yes, thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks a lot to our panelists. I think there is no more Q&A questions in the chat, so we're going to close now. And I want to thank again our panelists, the report authors. All the resources are posted online. Please reach out if you can't find them. And I guess this is it. Thank you very much. The recording will also be posted and shared for all of those that registered, but who couldn't attend. Thanks a lot again.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.